All right, we've begun our recording, and I'm going to welcome everybody to the first Zoom session for our Rose Trellis KAL. I am very excited to be doing our third annual Summer Shawl KAL because I really enjoy these, and it's a lot of fun to design a shawl that takes us on an expedition to somewhere. So the last two, we've had a staycation and we've had a summer road trip. So this time I decided that it would be really fun to take us to one of my favorite places on earth, which is the Rose Garden in the Bouchart Gardens on Vancouver Island. You can find them online, and I know in one of the newsletters I dropped a link to their website, so you can go and actually look at it online and you can see the rose trellises that inspired the shawl and the rose beds. And in fact, one of our staff, Naomi, was there just a few days ago, and she went and took a bunch of pictures in the rose garden so that she could send them to me and say, look, I'm actually here with my rose garden shawl. So that was a lot of fun. Well, rose trellis. So the whole idea between this shawl was something that would be fun to knit and that would look deceptively complicated, but really would be fairly approachable in the grand scheme of things. So instead of doing stranded color work, we use mosaic because mosaic only works with one color at a time, and then some simple twisted stitches to make some roses that are hiding a little bit in the underbrush. One of the things I really love about the rose garden that was the inspiration for this is that they have all sorts of different species of roses. So they have things like the prairie rugosas that were developed by some university in Manitoba, and they're incredibly hardy, but they have very little roses. They have roses that are climbing roses that grow to 5+ meters tall and will have sizes of flowers that can be everything from small to enormous. And then, of course, there's the big tea rose gardens as well. So all of that is in this shawl in some way, shape, or form, and hopefully in a form that you guys find fun to do. So I wanted to go through the pattern and just give you the lay of the land, as it were. If you're looking for things you haven't started yet, you're beginning, anything like that, it's just helpful to know where in the pattern all of these bits and pieces are. So the general shape of the shawl itself is what's called an asymmetric bias shawl. So that's a triangle that curves off to the side. And so it continues to get bigger and bigger as it goes, but it also has a curve. Why would we choose that? Well, one of the reasons I choose it is that I really find triangle shawls that aren't that big hard to wear because you put them around your shoulders or you tie them as a bandana and they promptly fall off, and in my case, inevitably land somewhere that either a cat grabs it and runs with it or it's a puddle. So asymmetric bias shawls have a natural curve built into them, and they tend to sit on the shoulders really nicely. And this one is a bit bigger than the summer road trip, which also used the same shawl structure, because I wanted a shawl that would be really nice to wear when it would be a bit cold, and so you could get a couple of wraps around your shoulders and you had some styling options. So there's lots of different ways that you can wear this shawl, and if you look at the photos for this particular piece, you'll see my models very happily styled it in lots of different ways as we took the photos. The only thing we forgot to do was to take a big picture with the shawl being held out, so I still aim to do that and get that posted on both our website and on Ravelry so you guys can see the shape. But it is a nice curve that goes off to the side. And what you'll notice is that on the inside of that curve, there is a slip stitch edge, which is fairly strong and sturdy. And on the outside, what we have is an edge that is a garter stitch. And what the garter stitch edge does is it just gives a little more elastic of a nature to it for when it curves around the outside. So I've used that before in some of my designs, and I like it because it gives you a bit of ease as it's wrapping around the wider part of your shoulders, but the part against your neck is nice and smooth so that it's not grating on you like sandpaper. So that's a little trick that I use to give some structure to a shawl, give some ease to a shawl, and also make it a little bit more pleasant to wear. So that gets described at the beginning of the pattern. And then we get into the yarn used. And so there's two different color options for this shawl. The original uses 3 colors, but it's not necessary if you don't want to use 3 colors. So for what I called the blossom bands on the shawl, there are contrast colors used in those bands, but you can also use the second main color there if you would so choose. There is enough yarn left that you can do that. The contrast color is just there if you want to add a little extra pop, and I've seen some people doing some really neat things. So for example, Mona has been posting in our Facebook group, and she has used a third color and she's changing up her blossom bands, which is really fun. So some of them she's put some green into them, and some of them it's the background color and a lovely purple. So definitely a place that you can play. And you could, if you wanted to, add a fourth color and just again play with the blossom bands in that way. There is enough yarn to not do that and just have two colors, or you can add additional colors and play with them in those bands. I don't recommend using mini skeins for the big mosaic rose bands that have two colors, simply because you would have a good chance of running out of yarn on the bigger ones if you are using like smaller mini skein amounts of yarn. But the pattern is written so that you can either use two colors, or you can use three colors, or you can get really creative and throw in all sorts of odds and ends. One of the things I think that would be really fun for this shawl would be to like just use up some bits and pieces and make those blossom bands different colors throughout the whole thing. So I haven't done that personally with this shawl, but that was something that was on my mind as I looked at my vast piles of little partial mini skeins and thought, next time I think I'm going to do something that would allow for that. Okay, a few notes on page 2 of the pattern that are fairly important. One of them is for near the end of the shawl when you do the final border on it, and it says if you're a loose knitter, you may wish to change to smaller needles when working the border to prevent ruffling. So the border on the shawl is a lace, and it's rather an interesting one because it's shaped like leaves. Yes, my shawl is purple, so not everybody picked up that those were leaves, but it's a leaf shape. And if you don't want them to ruffle and you're a loose knitter, changing to one needle size down from the main shawl needle will mean that you won't get ruffling. So ruffles are fine. If you like ruffles, let it happen. Don't worry about that. There is some extra yarn built into the pattern because everybody's gauges will vary. And if you're like me, you go, sure, I know how big I knit. And then you end up with a Stephen West shawl that's 9 feet across. That was never me, really. Anyway, so when you get there, if you don't want it to ruffle, you want to change your needle size, and that's on page 2, just mentioning that. And then there's a note about, and we'll get to this when we get to the mosaic part, about the key for the mosaic chart tells you about colors, do not knit the key. So those are just there to let you know about a couple of things to keep your eye on once you get to those places in the pattern. And then on page 3, we have some stitches and abbreviations. And on the top of the page in the left-hand column, that's where you'll find how to do the left twist and the right twist in the twisted roses. So they're not written out in terms of the main pattern. They are there so that if when you go to work that stitch, you can just follow that, and it is every single step written in there so that you will be able to go and refer to that on how to do a twisted stitch. I'm going to show you what it looks like if you did a twisted stitch or if you do just a 1x1 cable. You can do either of them. Really, the main difference is that the cable stitches will not pop as far off of the fabric, so they're a little bit more subtle, and I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. But for those of you who haven't started the shawl yet and don't know where to go to find out how to do those, they are on page 3 on the top left. And then on page 3 on the bottom right, just the way this is formatted, we have one more technique, and that's how to cast off purlwise. And we will use that in the border when we're making the leaves. So we're going to go into the border in the second zoom and get real detailed on that one because it's a rather interesting lace. It has a long history of being around, and I know my tech editor, who is extremely experienced and has worked with magazines for decades, was all, what is this? This is weird. Well, I have a tendency to find old lace patterns and play with them, and that is exactly what happened with this one. But you will find this lace mirror image and deeper in Barbara Walker's stitch dictionaries, for example. So it's been around, quite well known. It shows up in a lot of stitch dictionaries, but it does have its origins probably back in the late 1800s because not 1800s, yeah, 1800s. Anyway, I do like playing with these old laces, and I feel that they offer a lot in terms of uniqueness and scope. So our border is done like that. And then the bind off that's part of the border is on that page 3 bottom right. So now let's start looking at our twisted roses, which means that I am going to switch camera views. We'll get an exciting view of my book. And then we look down at the shawl. All right. So let's make sure that this is spotlighted so that we don't end up with anybody not seeing this later on. So what we have here is the shawl itself and a nice little view of our mosaic rose and our blossom buds. And then here are our twisted stitch roses. So the twisted stitch roses are not as obvious as the mosaic. And this, from a designer's point of view, was just something fun because the roses are hiding in all of the other flowers and the foliage and the leaves for me. So they show up much more noticeably depending on how the light hits them. Sometimes when you're looking at it dead on, they might be a little difficult to see, especially if it's a busier yarn like this one, but they will show up in sunlight and you will see them. And they're also a very fun stitch to work. One of the things I like about twisted stitch better than doing cables is that you're not having to move the stitches around on the needles. That's all done while you work them. So we begin with a twisted rose at the very start of the shawl. And we only have one. And that's something I wanted to point out to you guys, is that every single time we come to a band that has roses, so we start off with one rose, we get to the next band, you'll notice it has 2 roses. The third band will have 3 roses. So each section that has roses in it will add another one as you go through the shawl. So we get to lucky number 7 in the final band of roses. So that's something to bear in mind. And at the start of each one of the sections that has a rose, whether it's twisted or mosaic, it's going to tell you how many roses are in that section, just to make it easy to remember how many repeats of the chart that you're going to be doing. So I just wanted to point that out because I know that I've had the odd person who was contacting me and being a bit confused. The other thing to bear in mind is that no matter how many roses there are always 3 stitches in between, whether it is a mosaic rose or it is a twisted stitch rose. And at each end, you have garter stitch stripes. So the chart will begin right at the edge of the shawl, but as the shawl continues its shaping, you get more and more stripes forming on the right hand of the shawl. And on the left, you will have that same garter stitch stripes, and then they will get smaller and smaller. Let's get this on the thing. They will get smaller and smaller as you go because you are shaping the shawl to pull in on that side. So that is to be expected, that you will have garter on both sides. Don't worry about how many stitches there are. You don't need to count them on either side of the roses because it's all taken account of in terms of how the pattern is written. I could have made you count them on every single row, but personally I would lose my mind. So it's all working out. As long as you start your chart at the beginning of the rows the way the section will tell you to do, you will be fine. You will have enough stitches. Now, with that one little word, every single one of the blossom bands will use exactly the same instructions, no matter how many stitches are on your needles. If you miss a few increases, you're going to spot that when you go to do one of the blossom bud bands because it won't be exactly the same in terms of the stitches don't fit. So that'll be a cue to you that you have lost some stitches somewhere. In other words, you missed an increase or 2 on the edge, and that is so easy to do. If that's the case, you can fudge it and you can just cast on a few stitches by doing a knit front and back in the row to just get back to the right number of stitches, and no one will ever know, I promise you. Or you can go back and look for where you made that error. So it's very easy in an asymmetric bias shawl to forget an increase along the way. And it's also very easy to fix it by just throwing in an extra increase or 2 somewhere if you missed them. So you'll want to check the stitch count at the end of each section to be sure that you've got it right. But if you get to one and you find you don't have the right number of stitches to match, fudge it. I tell you, no one will ever see it because you see the little crinkly bits underneath there. You can hide an increase in there and you're never going to have a problem with it. It's pretty hard to get too many stitches because of the way that the increases are happening on every single row. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but I just want to give you permission from the designer to fudge it if your number of stitches changes a bit. I'm also going to warn you that the stitches at the end of the rows in each section, so the twisted roses, for example, there won't be the same number of stitches necessarily at the end of each section as there are like throughout. So it might change a little bit based on the math of the shawl. So I'm heading off at the pass. Anyone who's worried about the fact that they didn't have the same number of stitches here as they had here. That's just the way that the pattern works. It's consistent throughout the entire set of repeats of the chart. The eye will not notice if there's a few stitches difference there between sections. That is intentional, and do not worry about it. The blossom buds, however, are all identical, and that you would want to worry about. And while we're here looking at this, there's one other thing that I want to point out is that there are 6 rows in between the mosaic and the blossom buds all through the shawl until you get to the very last band. Please note that there are only 4 here. So if you make the boo-boo, which is very easy to do, of doing 6 because you've gotten into the rhythm of the rest of the shawl, Don't worry about it. I will tell you what to do to deal with the border, and it's not going to harm anything. So you can be a little bit loosey-goosey with the stitch count if you forget an increase, because it's easy to fix it. And if you are a perfectionist and cannot stand that, well, we can get you through it by potentially working back. If you're concerned, put a lifeline in the shawl periodically, and that's just get a thin, smooth strand of whatever it is, whether it's unwaxed dental floss or embroidery thread, and just run it through the stitches on a row periodically, because then you can rip back to that and it'll hold your stitches. So lifelines are glorious things, but honestly, I think you're going to be okay with this once we go through how to do all of these bits and pieces. Okay. So let's set this aside and look at how we do the twisted stitches. So before we get into those, now there are ways to customize what we did in the shawl. And this swatch here is a twisted rose. And we have twisted stitches on the bottom half of the rose here, and we have 1x1 cables up here. And there is actually a difference. And you can see that the twisted stitches, and this is unblocked, you can see that they are sitting up higher off of the fabric than the cables. So you kind of lose the cables in places. So you can do that if you loathe and despise the twisted stitches. You can switch to cables. Just be aware of the fact that they will be harder to see, especially if you've got a bit of a busy colorway. So you can see that the cable kind of disappears here and is a little bit more visible there, disappears again here. And it's just the nature of how the stitch is worked. When you twist the stitch, you tighten them up and you lift them up off the surface of the fabric. So then they are much more noticeable. Honest, it is nicer to do the twisted stitch than the tiny cables, because like I say, you're not taking any stitches off of the needles. You just have to do some kind of funky things to work them both on the needles that will twist them at the same time as you are knitting them. So all of the patterning in this section is done on the right side rows, and the wrong side rows are all just purled. So it's just plain stocking stitch. Twisted stitches lift the fabric up, and so even the purl row that has nothing twisted on it will look as if it's raised. Whereas why you're losing some of the stitches in the cables here is due to the fact that they are not raised. Now there's something else I want to show you before we get into looking at the stitches here, and that is, you'll notice that some of these are a bit wonky. And it happens with SSKs and it happens with cables, and there's a whole bunch of details as to why it happens, and Patty Lyons has some really interesting information on that if you want to know about it. But if you have wonkiness, whether it's in your twisted stitches or in your little cables, you can fix this. So this guy heads off at a little bit of an angle to the rest of them, and he's small. So just come along after and take a needle and give it a tug. If the stitch isn't standing up enough and it looks a bit smaller, put the needle under both legs of it and just pull it. So you see how now it's a little bit straighter and a bit more distinct. So you can fix stitches that are doing weird things and heading off in a weird crinkly direction by using your needle. So this one here looks a little bit smaller. And again, just put your needle under there and give it a tug. And what that will do is redistribute the yarn from other stitches to make it a little bit larger. So you can go and you can tweak these to straighten your line and get the stitches to be a little bit more uniform if there's some small ones. And then this little section here, we can see that again. So this guy, he's kind of off to the side. He's not very well executed. So we grab his leg and we straighten him. And then we can also put underneath both legs the needle and tug him up. And now you can see it's a little bit better defined. The one above is a purl row, and you could give that one a bit of a yank to try and help make that cable look a bit more noticeable as well. Sometimes you got to go back and do it twice too. So this is something that you can do to go along and fix these. It is the nature of how these stitches are executed that causes them to be out of line and a little bit wonky. And again, Patty Lyons has some really good information as to why that happens. She also has lots of ways to deal with it while you're working them. And I am sorry, but I am far too old to change my ways now. I just go along with the needle later on and fix them, and they look perfectly fine. So I just wanted to show you, if you have something wonky, it happens to all of us, and you can easily fix them. So same with these guys. If there was something about them you didn't like, you can take them and tweak them and make them more distinct. You can straighten the stitch. You can even out the stitch size, that sort of thing. So very easy and quick to fix those. All right, now actually working the two twists. So we have a swatch here, and I've got some bigger yarn than the shawl uses just so that we can see it a little bit easier. When we're working these stitches, we work them together on the left needle. So there's nothing being slid. halfway and moved and things like that, although we will do a little bit of something, which is to turn the stitches on the left twist in order to get them to the right angle to work them. Okay, I just see some comments in our chat, and I'm just going to take a look in it because I'm sure there's some good ones. In Twisted Rose, does it help to work some of the pearls through the back of the loop to improve direction? I've never found that to really be the case, because sometimes it's actually the one that's worked on the knit side that is the issue. And it's all about how much yarn is used and where the tension is on the stitches. So for me, it's much faster to just go back and to give it a quick tug with the needle than it is to try and figure out which ones to purl and so on. It's a great question, but I don't really find that it makes that big a difference to the work to try and fix it on the backside. It might be that you'll do every rose in the entire shawl and maybe have one or two wonky stitches. So I did them fairly deliberately with the cables in this swatch so I could show you fixing them. And it's actually a tip that's super helpful for SSKs on sock gussets, because those ones can sometimes be a little bit zigzaggy. And that's a cheat trick that I use on socks all the time, because again, I don't feel like fiddling around with my SSK to figure out exactly what's going to make it align. So it's just a nice little trick that I've learned along the way. And like I say, Patty Lyons goes into the whole subject in great depth. So she's got a great book and a great workbook, lots of videos. You'll find a lot of free videos that she's done on the subject, and they're well worth looking at. So to work a twisted stitch, let's do the one to the right first. And that one is the easier of the two. So what we're going to do is first center this. We're going to put the needle through the next two stitches on the left-hand needle. We're just going to put it through both of them. And we're going to make a stitch, but we don't pull those stitches off the left-hand needle. We leave them there. I will often put my finger there to protect them so that they don't bounce off. Give your stitch a little bit of a tug and make it a little bit larger than you necessarily will want it to give yourself a bit of slack. And then you're going to put the needle through the middle of the two stitches there. And then you're going to knit. So that gives you 2 on the right needle, 2 on the left needle. And what you're going to do at this point is just pull both of them off the left-hand needle. So now you've worked your 2 stitches, and you see that they're kind of sitting different from a normal stitch on the needle. And that's because they're twisted and they cross over each other. When you go back on the wrong side and purl, they will flatten out and look exactly the way they should. But that's the right twist. So let's do that again. We take the needle and we put it through 2 stitches on the left-hand needle. Knit, but leave those stitches on there, and I hold them on with my finger. If you're doing continental, your finger will still be able to protect those stitches. Give this a little bit of slack. So if you're a real tight knitter, give that a little bit of a tug, because when you give that a little bit of slack, that helps your twisted stitches to lie nice and flat on the surface. Put the needle in between the 2 of them through the first stitch on there. So you are knitting in that stitch. Make your stitch. Hold those on there until you've got your stitch complete. And then you pull the 2 off the left needle. So here's 2 twists at the same time, or right beside each other on the needle. I'll go back and knit those after so you can see what they look like. So any questions on that? Hopefully that was nice and clear. Pretty happy with my camera, although it's showing all the dye on my hands that I couldn't get off my poor thumbnail. And I think what I'll do is I'll just work one more so that you guys can watch. So both stitches on the left, knit, holding them on there, give it a wee bit of a tug, needle down through the middle of those stitches and through the first one like you would normally knit. Once you've completed your stitch, pull them both off. So that's the right twist. And again, they make kind of like a funky twisted V. Now, the left twist is just a little bit more complicated, because instead of doing the stitches as they lie on the needle, what you're going to do is slip 1 stitch knitwise, slip the second stitch knitwise, and then we're going to put them back on the left needle without straightening them out. So once they're now mounted backwards on this needle, so instead of the right leg being at the front, it's now at the back, what we're going to do, and I am just going to read out what's on the top of page 3 there so that we know what we're doing in terms of what it sounds like versus what I'm doing. So we're now going to place both stitches back on the needle. Now we're going to knit in the back of the second stitch on the left-hand needle and not take it off. So instead of like the right hand where we knit through 2 of them at the same time, this one's the opposite. So we're going to go to the back of the second stitch. So there's the back of the second stitch, and we're going to make a knit stitch through there. And again, hold this on there with your fingers if you need. give it a little bit of a tug, and you've knit there without pulling any stitches off this needle. Next, you're going to go through both stitches at the same time, and you're going to knit. And now, whoops, now what you're going to do, hold them on there until you've got both of these, and you know that you've gotten through there without having done anything wild and crazy, because every once in a while they do that. Now you can pull them off the needle. And again, we can see that there's a funky little thing going on here. That's the twist and the cross. So showing you again, slip one stitch knitwise, slip one stitch knitwise, put them back on the needle purlwise, the left-hand needle. So slip them back as they are oriented on the right once you have done that slip knitwise. Go to the back, and now you're going to put your needle through the second stitch on the needle. So right-hand needle goes through second stitch on left-hand needle, knit a stitch. Don't pull anything off of the left-hand needle. And there's your stitch sitting through the back one, through the back of the loop of the second stitch. Then you put your needle through both stitches on the left-hand needle and knit again. And now you can drop those two off of there. So there's your left cross, and you can see that side by side. This one is a little bit weird looking, but it's leaning right, and these ones are leaning left. So I'm just going to purl back so that you can see what they look like. It's fun because the tension on this is weird to me. I did not knit the swatch. One of my staff very kindly made it for me. So my tension and her tension are not the same. All right, let's turn this around, and now we can see these stitches lying quite nicely on here. So you can see that these are raised and going to the left, the two that we did to the left. And then the three that we did to the right, again, are twisted to the right, and they're sitting up nice and high on the fabric. Hopefully with the camera, you can see that. So they're quite easy to work. If you're not familiar with doing this, go to that top of page 3 and just follow step by step, because I've written it out step by step there so that you know what to do with each part of the stitch. So do we have any questions about that? Let's check the chat. Okay, left slant. Yeah, we got that. So thank you for asking about that one, because we would hate to miss out on the poor left-hand slant, because that's fairly important in forming these flowers. One last thing that I want to mention on this. This is kind of interesting, and in my next design, which will come out soon, you'll see that I changed it, but the lines don't necessarily perfectly connect. These are twisted stitch patterns that were designed by Nora Gahn, and I thought that the way that the petals don't quite line up, so it's really noticeable with the cable on this one that they don't sit right at the end here. They don't line up, and I like the way that that gave a little bit of sort of almost a frill to the petal. So when you go along and do this chart, if you're like, oh my goodness, this isn't lined up with the exact end of the horizontal line forming the petal, that's fine. That's what it looks like. I will admit that in my next design, I used a similar twisted stitch flower, and in that case, I moved them because for what I was doing, it made more sense. So just on another background, and this is kind of fun because this was back when I was still testing the concept of this shawl, and I had actually tried it as garter stitch, and it didn't really work because you have an issue between stocking stitch being taller than garter stitch, but you can see in a semi-solid color that the rose pops a little more. And you could, if you want to convert your shawl into garter stitch, you just have to be real careful about when you block it. I would put wires around the square with the rose to block it properly, but I didn't really like it in garter. I just kind of felt like it wasn't flowy enough. So this is what the rose looks like in a solid color, but this is the prototype of the shawl, so it did not stay garter stitch. So remember that the twisted flowers are done on a stocking stitch background. All right, let's make sure that we have covered everything, because I made lots of notes about all the questions I've been asked until now. So I think we've done that. I'm going to move along fairly quickly because we do have a lot going on in the body of the shawl and I don't want to miss anything. So the next thing that we're going to do is our blossom buds. So blossom buds is a stitch that you will find named a whole bunch of different things based on what the stitch dictionary that was used versus what the designer wanted to call them. So you'll find them out there referred to as everything from star stitch to daisy stitch. I called them blossom buds because they looked like little flower buds opening to me. But what they are is something that gives you these cute little sort of bursts of stitches They're really easy to work, but if you've never done them before, there are a few things to like pay attention about them. First of all is that the part that actually creates the little stars, and you'll see 3 stitches that have a loop around the bottom that make those little flowery, starry things. And let's turn this right way up so that you can see them from another angle. Those are done on the wrong side. And the other thing is if they are properly executed, they actually form diagonal lines. So when you're working them, you'll know that you have everything lined up properly if the next one, after the first set of them, sits in between the two and forms a line. Really, you won't see that line, diagonal line of this stitch until you have at least 3 sets of them. So just something to pay attention to. I did find it fascinating that by pure luck, this shawl mathed out to have exactly the same stitch count in terms of what you do at the beginning and the end in each section. So the first row of all of them is just a plain knit row on the right side. It's the wrong side row where we get all excited to do some stuff. And it's actually surprisingly easy to work. But one of the tips for this is, if you are struggling with this, make sure that you use a nice pointy needle. So a longer tip on your needle, a pointy needle, will help you get through your stitches, especially if you are a tight knitter. So sometimes people who knit really tightly, it's hard to do a purl 3 together because that's what is involved in this. So a nice long pointy needle will make it easier. If you have a really blunt needle with a shorter tip, then you might find that that's a little bit harder to work. So just one of the helpful hints that I have for you is that in this particular section, a nice pointy needle is a wonderful thing. So when we work them, we're doing a purl side. And yes, this is still stocking stitch, but what we're going to do is we're going to purl through 3 stitches. I hold the stitches on there with a finger, whether I would be continental or throwing style, and I get my needle through all 3 stitches because I'm going to purl 3 together. So you're going to make your purl stitch. And what you're going to do is you're going to help that stitch through there without letting these guys fall off, because we're going to do things. So we've purled 3 together rather, making 1 stitch on the needle. Give it some slack. So you notice how it's bigger than a normal stitch would be like that. If you give it some slack, the stitch will look nicer on the front side, and it also is easier to work. You've got a little bit of ease on there. So again, tight knitters, give that a little pull and give yourself some slack. We've done our first purl 3 together. We're going to wrap the yarn around as a yarn over, and then we're going to purl 3 together again. And again, I hold those stitches on with my forefinger until I know I've got my purl 3 together done, and then they come off. So that gives us 3 stitches on the right needle. So we haven't lost anything, but what we have is a normal purl, we have a yarn over, and a normal purl. And then in between there, we have a purl 1. You will notice there's a gap in between these. This is normal, so don't worry about it. If you have a gap, that's what you expect to see. So let's work another star here. So again, we're going to purl 3 together. Tease your needle through there, make your purl stitch, give it some slack, yarn over, purl 3 together. And you don't have to push the needle all the way through when you're doing that. And make sure that you've given yourself a little bit of a loosening on that, and then drop the 3 because you've done your second purl 3 together. So again, you see how there's a gap in between the purl 3 togethers and the single stitch in between each one of those. So let's do that again. We're going to purl 3 together, give it some slack, yarn over, purl 3 together, and drop the stitches off the needle. So we got 1 more to go here. Purl 3 together, yarn over, remembering to put a little bit of slack into these stitches by tugging on them. And then we've reached the end of my little swatch, so let's turn it over and look at those. So you can see that in the end, they do now form a more distinct diagonal line of these stitches. The next row, no matter what it is that you're doing, whether you would be doing more of these stitches, so if you had a particular shawl, for example, that used in star stitch for a longer section, the diagonal will continue to form. Regardless, the next row is going to be knit, and that will finish off the star and let those stitches show better. So this is one that was done with 6 rows, 2 rows each color. So that gives you the same band that we have in the shawl. And you can see how once we've gone along there, we get our nice little stars forming. When it's on the needle, you really see that wrap, which is actually the top of the stitches that were purled together. So anything I have else to say about that? Not really. Just wanted to point out that a sharp needle helps with that. So are there any questions about that? Nope. Excellent. All righty. And again, if you have questions later on and the Zoom is over, feel free to email me. You can email through our website. If you know my personal email, which is caroline@ancientartsfiber.com, feel free to email that. You can come into the studio. You can call us. We're happy to help in no matter what way that you need us to do so. So make sure that you contact us if you are concerned about anything. The next thing that happens in this pattern are these mosaic roses. So our friendly mosaic roses are done with a chart. And again, in between, we have garter stitch that's just striped. So the mosaic roses form from the chart that we have. They have a band of stitches around the outside that gives them a little bit of definition. They are all in garter. The rest of the shawl is in stocking stitch. Now, there are things that you can do to modify this section if you want to. So for example, you could make just the roses garter stitch, and you could make the bits in between and on the outside stocking stitch. So it's up to you if you do that. There's a little bit of a different tension between garter stitch and stocking stitch. So if you do the roses only in garter stitch and do this as stocking stitch, this is going to flare a little bit. That's not going to hurt anything. You can help it a little bit when you block it, or you can just let that outer edge of the shawl flare more, which is what would happen. And I'm like, oh no, it's a little bit rounder than it would have been. It'll actually look super pretty. So it's not a problem to do that. And it does mean that you can customize the look of your shawl a little bit. So I always like pointing out the fact that a pattern is not written in stone, and you can absolutely change things up to suit your own self. So there's no problem with changing things. There are no knitting police and no one's going to get you. So there's a question in the chat that says, I'm reading the pattern wrong because the side stripes are coming out stockinette and not garter. All right. So unfortunately, I decided to take a week off, and there was a snafu with the pattern, and that part didn't get corrected. So the initial version of the pattern that came out had those sections in stocking stitch. And they look super pretty, which is why I'm saying it would be a really nice way to make a modification there. But we have updated the pattern, and there is errata on our website so that it corrected it to be garter stitch all the way through, because the original shawl is garter stitch. I do know that we have some members of the KAL who said, I like the look of the stocking stitch, so they didn't change the updated version of the pattern. But if you don't have version 1.05, just download your pattern again, whether it's from Ravelry or from our website, and you will get the correct version of the pattern that has had that part updated. So fun fact, we had test knitting done on this, and I did not see that the test knitters were doing stocking stitch. I can't believe that I wrote it that way, but there's reasons why I did. And we did change it to match the original. So that's what's going on there. You're not reading the pattern wrong. It's just not the most up-to-date version of the pattern. But it was a really serendipitous thing to see, because it's super pretty and it's a very fun way to work mosaic stitch. And I have used that in other shawl patterns to great effect. So it's something that you can leave. So if you have already worked some of your mosaic roses, the errata page would be on our website. So if you're looking for the errata for the shawl, we have an errata page on our website that has errata for all the patterns that we've published. And all you have to do is scroll down to the Rose Trellis, and then it'll tell you all of the changes that have been made. So you need version 1.05, and then that'll give you those corrections on that. It's quite funny how just 4 characters were incorrect, and that caused the whole thing to be stocking stitch on the ends. So you can leave it. If you've worked the mosaic already and you have stocking in between and on the ends, leave it. It's very pretty. I've seen finished, well, almost finished shawls, because everybody is knitting at different rates, and I've seen them done both ways. I've also seen one that was knit with garter in between the roses and stocking on the end. So I was like, wow, that's really creative. I give you license to change it in any way that you want. But let's talk about how mosaic stitch is worked. So the pattern for this has you going to a section of mosaic. So our first mosaic rows will tell you, and it gives you 4 rows. It tells you how you start to establish the pattern. So it tells you that you're going to slip yarn with yarn in front. You're going to knit 1, yarn over, place a marker, because the marker is going to be on each side of each one of the chart repeats. And then you're going to work the first row of the mosaic chart. You're going to place a marker. And then when you're doing more than 1 repeat, you have knit 3 in between them, placing markers again, so that you will then be able to just work the chart between the markers and knit everything else. So That's what this is doing. It is establishing how you're going to work. It's not writing out the entire chart. You'll actually find the entire chart written out at the back of the pattern. And what you would do is you establish what you're doing at the beginning, end, and in the middle, and then you can just go to the chart itself, which is on page 12. And I'm just going to check the chat here. Will it look okay to leave the 3 stitches between the 2 patterns in stockinette? Absolutely. So I've seen some examples published in our Facebook group where people are doing that, and it looks very pretty. So you can knit just the roses in garter and do the rest in stocking stitch, and it's really nice. And yeah, Karen has added in the chat that she's been doing that. So if you want to go to our Facebook group, you'll be able to see some Karen pictures that she has very kindly posted in the group, and it looks really lovely. So you do not have to worry about that. And I think it's a really neat idea that, you know, it was a serendipitous mistake in the pattern. Yes, I changed it so it matched the shawl, but it also showed us a way to make a really unique thing that is very pretty. So it makes the roses tight, and then the border around them spreads out a little bit, rather like the leaves of a rose. When we look at a mosaic chart, this one is a little different from what you'll see a lot of the time because it has this line here. And I put this line here because it's a pain to try and remember what color you're supposed to be working with in the rose if you use different colors from black and white, which is what the chart is in. So if this was my nice speckle color, which I use for my background, this little key tells me I'm using the light color. This key tells me I'm using the dark. Yes, this is in lights and darks in here, but the key just reminds you that everything on the outside of the charts, around the charts, is done in these colors because at this point here, this is not actually the working color. So when you work mosaic, 2 rows at a time are knit with the same color. So when you begin this, the first 2 rows of the chart, the first 2 rows of the mosaic are knit with the light color. The next 2 rows of the chart are knit with the dark color, and there's some stitches to be slipped. So you're knitting on the right side with the dark color, and you're knitting on the wrong side with the dark color. And then you switch to the light color for the 5th and 6th rows. And it continues alternating throughout the whole pattern. But here, you have to brain it, as my husband so interestingly put it the other day, to remember what color you're using when you get to the chart. So that's why this is here, is to remind you that this pair of rows is actually worked with the dark color because we have a light border around the rows. So when you're slipping stitches, it reminds you that your working color is this one, because I tell you, if you are watching Scandinavian Noir, it is very easy to forget what the working color is, and suddenly you have 4 rows of the same one, and you realize that now I've got to tink back. So you're going to be working 2 rows in the same color all the time in mosaic. So mosaic is not like stranded colors where you're carrying both colors across the row. You only ever work with one, which makes it so much more user-friendly. So I often use mosaic in place of stranded color work in patterns because it's much more friendly to work, and you can play a lot with textures and things like that in a way that you can't with stranded. I suppose you could mix purl stitches and knit stitches with stranded color work, but it's not very often done, and it would get very awkward. So that's what mosaic does, is it works 2 at a time, only 1 working color. If you've never knit mosaic, what's going to happen on row number 3 here is that you'll do the beginning, which is in the other part of the pattern. Then you get to the chart where your marker is. So you're going to knit the dark color stitches and you're going to slip the light color stitches. So that's why there's V's in all of these. A V with no dot means slip it with the yarn in the back. A V with a dot means slip it with the yarn in the front. So when you're on the wrong side rows, what we have to do is move the yarn to the front of the work, which is at the back, and then slip your stitches so that you don't end up with bars of yarn on both sides. There are ways to fix that if it happens, but right now we're just going to worry about getting those stitches knit. This is not a 100% beginner mosaic chart because it has you slipping 2 and 3 stitches in some places. So I wanted to show you that just in case you're a little bit worried about what do I do when I'm slipping multiple stitches. It's a little bit like stranded color work in that you don't want to pull those strands super tight, because what you'll do is end up with bunching in your fabric. And while that can be really interesting because it creates a raised element, it's not actually what we're trying to go for. So when you're slipping those stitches, we want to leave some slack as we slip those stitches. So we have here a swatch, and I have started doing the chart in a larger yarn so that it's a little easier to see what we're doing. And you can see that in my case, the light color is some sort of gray, and then the dark color is red. And this is actually a combination of Lasco, DK, and Harley. So it's a little bit bulkier. It's all garter stitch. And again, you can change that if you want. This could be stocking stitch, not a problem. On the back, you can see that there are little loops of yarn, and this is where I have slipped the stitches. So this is just where I've slipped a stitch and the yarn had to carry across there. One of the tricks when you are slipping multiple stitches is that you want your yarn, do you see how this is just a little bit of a curve? Think of it as being shaped like a Mona Lisa smile. So we don't pull those tight. We leave a little bit of slack in there, just a little bit of a smile. And you'll find that on the first row, which is the right side row, when you slip the yarn, it's going to look like it's longer. When you do this coming back on the wrong side row, it looks a little bit shorter. And it's just the way that the yarn is going between the needles when you're doing the slipping. This may all be kind of Greek, but it's going to make sense because I'm going to demonstrate this. So you will have some strands on the back. They don't stick up very high, and you're not going to have an issue when you're wearing it later, because Mosaic, interestingly enough, does not believe in allowing lots and lots of stitches to be slipped at any time. The most you ever slip in Mosaic is 3. So this is the back of the roses, and you can see that there are not very long runs of the slipped yarn. Let's get this up a little bit higher so you can see it a little closer. So nice and easy to work, and it is a great gateway to stranded color work if you've never done that before. So let us work a couple of rows of this here so that you can see how it's done. And that also gives me a chance to talk about how we are going to carry the yarn up the side. So when you get to the Mosaic, the very first stitch is slipped, and you need to slip with the yarn in front. So what you're going to do is slip with the yarn in front, and then you have to change your colors. What do? Take the yarn that's in front right now and bring it between the needles and put it in the back. Now it's out of the way. It's not going to interfere with doing anything. And then pick up your next color, the one that you're now going to work with, and you're going to bring it underneath and up to the right. So that's actually an intarsia kind of cross. And what it does is that it's going to tuck the yarn up against the side of the edge so that it's kind of hidden. So when we look at, whoops, I just pulled stitches off. No, I didn't. Good. When we look at the edge of the shawl on the inside edge, that is tucked up nice and tight because it's crossing. So it's making basically elongated X's, and it tightens it up against the back of the shawl so that you don't have floppy loops. You can carry a lot of different colors that way. And there's a Stephen West shawl that I knit that used 5 colors in stripes. So you just carried them all up the side of the shawl. And as long as you do that trick where you bring the new yarn that's about to start working underneath the others to the right, it tucks them all against the edge of the shawl and keeps it very nice and tidy. So that's just a little trick that I wanted to show you there. Now we're going to knit where I have my little mark, because this is my next row here. So I know that I am knitting with my dark color, which in this case is a red. And you see how the first 2 stitches are slipped? So that's why that little key is there, to remind you that you're knitting with the red, because if you're like me, your brain might fall out and suddenly you don't know what you're doing and forget what color you're working with, or you're watching Scandinavian noir with subtitles, which is a real problem, and I really must stop doing that. So when we get to the first 2 stitches that get slipped, you slip them purlwise. There is a note at the start of the pattern that says, unless it says otherwise, all stitches are slipped purlwise. So we have slipped them. Now, in order to avoid pulling them really tight, space them out on your needle, spread them out, and then just knit your next stitch. What you want is to see that little Mona Lisa smile there. Just a little tiny bit of a smile. It's just standing up from the work, just a tiny, tiny bit. That's what we're looking for. It's not pulling your stitches tight in this case. So we can now continue on, having done our slipped stitches. So I'm knitting 3 red. When stitches have been slipped, notice this stitch is longer. This is normal. They will look like that. Sometimes in garter stitch Mosaic, people get really worried because they see these stitches that are stretched up in the work, and that is normal. It's because they've been slipped. So you expect to see that. Now we're slipping 3 stitches, and that's why I chose this row to show you. So I have slipped the 3 purlwise, spread your stitches out just a tiny bit wider than they normally would be in the work, and knit your stitch. And when they sit normally, you get that little bit of a bulge up on that strand. Let's see if we can bring this up and show you that there's just a little bit of slack in there. So now this isn't going to pull the work in, and those 3 can sit there normally configured. And now I have to knit 4 more. So again, you can see that these stitches that were slipped, see how they're a little bit elongated? Totally normal, to be expected. If it didn't look like that, then you're going to find that there's something weird about it, and it's going to be pulling and not lying flat. So again, we're slipping 3. I'm actually going to move this out of the way a little bit because it's doing funky things to the light. Anyway, we slip our 3, spread our stitches out. Then we are going to knit our stitch. So because we spread them out, you see that little loop there? If it's really big loop, if it's like that, that's too loose. And what's going to happen is that can catch, but more likely it's just going to make a big floppy stitch on the front. So just tug it in a little bit so that we just have a little bit of space between it and the body of the work, and then we're good for the tension. And then the last 2 stitches along the edge of the rose are slipped. Slip our marker, which is attempting to be a real rascal, and then the rest of it is knit. So my swatch isn't shaped like the shawl itself, but I think we can probably live with that. Now, when you go back, you can watch the pattern of the chart, or what you do is you just copy what was done on the first row, because each pair of rows are identical to each other. So we've come to some stitches to slip here. What we're going to do, because we are now on the wrong side of the work, we have to bring the yarn to the front to slip those stitches, or we'd have a bar across the front. If you do that, on the next row, you can actually pull the stitches off the needle, move the bar behind them, and then put them back on the needle. So they can be fixed. If you don't see it until the shawl is finished, duplicate stitch is our friend. And trust me, I have fixed a fair number of them in my time that way, including in an actual sample for a design. So you can see that the yarn on the wrong side row looks like it's not going as far. It is. It's just wrapping around. So don't worry about the fact that it doesn't look exactly the same. We have spread the stitches out just like we did on the other side in order to tension, slip, purlwise. We bring the yarn around. So we brought it to the back. Well, we brought it to the front, which is the back of the work. And then we put the yarn back to the other side so we can knit, having spread these stitches out so that we get a loop that has a little bit of slack in it and isn't pulling the work in. If you end up with a tight loop, it'll block out for the most part, as long as it's not super tight. If you have it tight on all of the ones at the edge, so I've brought my yarn to the front, slipping my 2 stitches, 3 stitches, bringing the yarn back so that I can knit, and you see how I stretched it out a little bit just to give it that bit of slack. If you get them tight on the edge, then what'll happen is that the edge of the rose is going to pucker, which could be interesting looking, and it could be something that you want to do intentionally, but it's not meant to be like that. So once we get to the border, we're just knitting the rest of the way. So I'm going to change colors again just to show you what I did again. Okay, once we are back and we are going to change colors, you'll find that quite often the edge stitch is quite loose. So you're just going to tighten that up a little bit so that it's back down in line with the rest of its buddies. So we're going to slip the stitch with the yarn in front because the entire right side of the shawl is done like that. Then this is not the color we want to work with anymore. We're going to put it in the back, drop it, pick up the new working color from underneath it, and then we can start working. Now, how tight do we make that? What I usually do is I pull that stitch and give it a little tug. So pull it up to be the normal size and then give it a little tug so that I don't end up making that so tight that it's going to pucker the edge of my shawl. I hope that made sense. But what I'm doing is just making sure there's a wee bit of slack in it. So I'm just going to turn it here so you guys can see that. So what you want is that little bit of yarn that's been carried due to the changing of the colors to be the height or length of the height of the rose. So you give it a little bit of slack, and you see how this one immediately loosened up. It's not the working yarn right now. So when we get back there after having worked 2 more rows, we will give it a little tug, and then it will come up and change to be the working yarn. So what time are we at? Good, we are moving along well. So alternating colors, that's how you change the colors. Remember that we do not want to work the key. The key is just there to remind us what The key is just there to remind us what color we're using, because of course we're changing pages. And once you've got in your head what you're doing on each of the shawl, you don't need to keep flipping back and forth. So once you've worked a few rows, you get the pattern, just leave it on the chart, work the chart. If you are a written person, I firmly believe in having the writtens, and they can help you if you're confused. So the entire chart on all of the charts is written out in the pattern at the back. This is one repeat. So it will give you a stitch count at the beginning here of this one. The chart is 21 stitches wide. It tells you 21 stitches. There are no changes in the stitch count throughout the entire chart. So that's why there's not a repeated stitch count for this. But this is one repeat of the chart. So if you were working 4 of these roses across, you would just work this, knit 3, work this, knit 3, work this, knit 3, work this, knit to the end of the row. So I hope that helps in terms of what you do with that. And whenever you're confused about a chart, the writtens are so helpful because you can go to them and you can see what's written out there. And sometimes it will be enlightening. You'll also see that it reminds you at the start of each row what color you're working with. So you can see here, row 1 with main color. Whoops, let's get this in the camera. I got this zoomed in for once and it's like, now I'm forgetting that it is. Row 1 with MC knit, row 2 with MC knit, row 3 with CC1. So this tells you to change the color. If you are unfamiliar with mosaic, we do not change the color throughout the row. The entire row is the same color, which is why if you have a mosaic motif in the middle of a work, you will always have stripes on the edge unless it goes right to the edge of the work. And the reason why is because you never change colors throughout the row. You could, and again, an interesting thing that you could try changing up is leave that in one color and then do intarsia to do your charts. That starts to sound like an awful lot of work, though. It could be interesting to see, but I don't recommend it necessarily. Okay, so reminder, if you get to the border before we get to the next zoom, then think about changing to a smaller needle if you're worried about it being floppy. Even if you're a fairly tight knitter, it's not going to hurt to change to a smaller needle. I have pretty good control over my gauge, so I will admit I just pulled my stitches tight. But the border is knit on to the main body of the stitches. And when we look at the charts for that, what we are going to see is a really interesting character. And this character on the edge of the charts just tells you that you're knitting the last stitch of the chart together with a stitch from the body through the back loop. So I'm just mentioning to you now to be aware of the fact that that happens. So that's what that weird little symbol means. I will demonstrate that when we get to the next zoom, but I did want to mention a little bit of that just so that anybody who gets there is not going to be surprised. The other thing about this is that this lace is rather intriguing, and I know that I had a very baffled tech editor because she was like, why are you binding off stitches and then continuing on? So this last row has you binding off some stitches and continuing on. Why are you doing that? Won't it leave a pucker? Well, interestingly enough, it does raise it up a tiny bit, but what it really does is it puts a lace hole there. So the end of the chart is right here, and you will see that there is a hole formed by that cast off. So these are 3 stitches that are bound off there. You get a little bit of a hole, and you get just a little bit of a raise there, which just gives this a nice little ripple. And what it does is it actually helps to make the leaf shape. It helps to dish it out. And you remember that little trick that I showed you with straightening your stitches? There are SSKs in the leaves, and if you happen to make wonky SSKs, you can fix them. So you can go along and you can say, ugh, that one was a little bit wiggly. I don't like that. Just go and tweak it a bit with a needle, and all of a sudden your SSK looks beauteous and perfect. So when you get to the lace, just a few things to pay attention. We'll work the lace in the next zoom, but I did want to point that out because some of us are faster than others, and there is a reasonable amount of time between now and the next zoom for the shawl. So the next shawl zoom is going to be September 6th, and that's where we will look at finishing. We will do some show and tell. We'll answer some more questions, and if anything pops up in things like the Facebook group or what have you, I'll be able to put that on my list of things to answer there. Reminder again, if you get to the end of the shawl here and you've got the wrong number of stitches, meh. This is actually a very forgiving border in terms of doing whatever number of stitches you have remaining. So I find that very intriguing. I was very proud of myself because I got to the end of the shawl and I hadn't actually done anything weird because I am the queen of missing the odd increase here and there, and I was bang on the math. But I will talk about that in the next zoom. So in case you have some stitch count issues, like I say, it doesn't matter. I will explain what to do about it if you do. So that brings us to 1 minute before the end of our Zoom. And would anybody like to ask any questions, give any feedback? I know that we have lots of studious persons looking at me here right now, which is great. And you're welcome to unmute and just talk. I think I addressed everything that's in the chat. Did anyone want to share their shawls at this point? Nicole is holding hers up. Just a second, Nicole, I'm going to spotlight you. Oh, very nice. Excellent job on your mosaic and all the rest of it. It looks beautiful.
Yeah,
so
my mosaic is done in stockinette. When the errata came up, I missed the part where it said to knit and not to do it in stockinette. And so that's what it looks like.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's actually, if I had to go back and redesign this shawl, I would have actually left it like that because I really like it. I like it better than my garter stitch. So that is really cool that you're able to share what it looks like.
Mm.
And I will admit that I had some test knitters and they sent me pictures, but somebody needed new glasses, which she now has, but I didn't see it at all. I just thought, what a beautiful shawl every time I got a picture from my various testers. Thank you.
I'm very much enjoying it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. Are the twisted stitches instructions on page 3 in version 1.05? Yes, it's not in the original version. So long story about what happened there. And it was, it doesn't really need to go into, but I do apologize for that. But like I say, sometimes it's a happy accident on things like that. Mona, did you want to share yours? Because you've got some really interesting colors going. All right, Mona gave me the thumbs up, so I'm going to spotlight hers. So Mona chose Killer Bees for her main color, and it's very vibrant and fun. And then she's using Cypress and Beaujolais, as I recall. But she has changed up the blossom buds on her shawl. So you see how she has one band that's got the purple and the green, and then the one that's next has the background color and the purple. And I thought that was very clever, very interesting use of color there. So I really like that. And like I say, very fun to see someone using Killer Bees. It's a very vibrant color, and it's going to make for a very exciting set of roses. My favorite color of roses are actually the ones that are kind of peach colored with the purpley red border. So I do find that quite fun that's quite similar to my favorite rose. Did anyone else want to share their shawl? Karen's got her hand up. Excellent. Ooh, gorgeous. You are muted, so in case you were trying to say anything, but I love your choice of colors. Look how dramatic that is.
I decided to go with blue roses because why not?
Yeah.
Be different.
Well, I really love the contrast. I think that's fabulous. Something that makes mosaic very exciting is to have stronger contrast. So I think it's beautiful.
Thank you. I used Christmas treats, which was what, 2 Christmases ago?
Yeah, something like that.
I think. And then where the giant squid live is my contrast color.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing that. All right, Stephanie has her hand raised. Where are you, Stephanie? There you are. Now I can spotlight you. I swear, every time I go to use Zoom, it's changed the software. Oh, very pretty.
I'm using one of your kits.
Fantastic. I haven't seen that one knit up before, so I'm quite excited to see it. It's beautiful, and your work is lovely.
And I think the contrast color is going to really pull it together too.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, beautiful. That's very fun to see. Thank you for sharing.
It's fun to do.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. That's one of the goals of all of these summer KALs. It's something that's fun and just a little bit different. I don't like shawls as well when they're just the same thing all the way through. So it's very hard for me to design shawls that are done the same all the way through. I just realized I could switch back to my delightful face. All right, so we are now at the end of our session time. Does anybody have any last questions, comments, thoughts? If not, I'm going to say thank you so much for spending an hour out of your evening with me. And thank you so much for joining me on my, oh, Karen had a hand up. Nope, okay. I just saw a hand.
I'm just telling Tanya if she wants to show her shawl, she has to raise her hand.
Oh, yeah.
I see her gesticulating, so.
Would you like to share yours, Tanya? All right. Tanya's microphone isn't working, so what we'll do is spotlight her. Oh, wow. Look at that. Again, we've got some really gorgeous drama here. As I recall from the group, I believe that Tanya chose some colors with the thoughts that this would be a really nice Christmas shawl. And I love it because it makes me think of poinsettias. Very pretty, Tanya. I love that. That's just very nice. Thank you so much. All righty. Thank you to everybody. I'm going to check the chat. There's some nice comments made in there about saying thank you. Wonderful. And I am looking forward to seeing your progress. One of the advantages, if you guys do want to go and join the Facebook group, and I think it's called Ancient Arts Yarns Community, is that if you post in the group, I know that one of my moderators likes to run a contest in that group for gift certificates. So feel free to post in there and feel free to ask questions. We've got some amazing people who've been helping answer questions there. I will be a little bit more available now that I am back from my week of taking art classes. The world does not need more bad landscape paintings, but by gum, I added some. And I'll be happy to help a little bit more there. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to seeing your progress. You guys have an excellent evening. Bye-bye, everyone.